Okay, we're on Roman numeral 8, which is page 4 of your outline. As we began talking last week, one of the greatest differences in the creation model and the evolutionary model, of course, is your perception or belief in the age of the world, the age of this universe. And frankly, there's no getting around it, even in discussing our last part of the outline, theistic evolution. The Bible, or the Word of God, is clear that God made this world in 6 literal 24-hour periods, not that long ago. And Jesus made it clear that man has been here from the beginning, is the exact phrase. And that's not very popular to believe in our world, but it's the truth. And when you compromise on that truth, that's when our young people begin to doubt the authority of God's Word. And we noticed some studies last week that show that that's one of the primary reasons that we lose so many of them. And there's no need to give ground to the evolutionists in these matters, and we're going to keep discussing this point over the next 3 major points of the outline as we talk about Genesis 1 through 11, the flood, and then the geologic timetable and the age of the earth. Because what the evolutionists won't tell you is that there are dozens of evidences for a young earth, even in scientific world, that doesn't fit their desires. And so you never hear about those. There is you might pick this up and peruse it. I thought it was kind of interesting. Out there on one of the, I think it's on this display stand where the track racks are. There's one called the Patriarch Timeline. It was kind of interesting to me because when you start thinking about the long ages of the patriarchs, 900-something years, of course you realize that Methuselah died the year of the flood began. Always makes me wonder whether the kind of fellow Methuselah was. Now, he could have died. But at any rate, or did he die in the flood? The Bible says he died. It's interesting, it overlays on the timeline the ages of the patriarchs. So the fact of the matter is, all the way up until the time of, let's see, there were several patriarchs that could have talked to Adam face to face. Because Adam lived to be so old, 930 years. Noah could have actually spoken to several of the patriarchs face to face, and several of those that lived afterward. And in fact, Noah would have still been alive when Abraham was born. So it's kind of interesting to me that if they lived in the same area, they knew each other. I mean, it's a lot of people, and but it's just kind of interesting the way the timelines overlap. So you might take a look at that. So we began to talk last week about this idea that, of course, that Genesis 1 through 11 is mythical, it's allegorical, it's poetic, according to certainly those that are atheistic or evolutionary. But the sad thing about that is that even many in the religious world, because they feel like they can't argue against, quote, science, will take that same position. And even in the church, this has been championed, theistic evolution, by John Clayton in years past. You may have heard his name. But recall in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, which is not in Genesis 1 through 11, Moses said, "In 6 days Jehovah had made heaven, earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day." Now, it's interesting, and let's see, BJ, but you brought up last week after class, and I think it's a good. We were talking about context in some other passages, and we didn't really mention it in Exodus chapter 20. But if you go over to Exodus chapter 20, before verse 11, look at the context in which this verse finds itself in verse 8. He says, remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Well, let me ask you this. Did the Hebrews understand what that meant? They understand that God meant 6 literal days, do your work?
I would think so.
Or did they think, oh, God meant 6 eons of time to do my work? No. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work. And then he gets to verse 11. For in what? 6 days. Somebody also brought up that last week before they left. I think it was Chris Raymond. You know, we minimize the power of God when we say, well, you know, he did it over long eons of time. Actually, the bottom line is God could have created the world any way he saw it. He could have spoken all of this into existence in a moment of time. Wouldn't have taken 6 days. Wouldn't have taken 6 million or billion years. Could he have done it in 6 billion years? I guess he could have if he wanted to. Could have done it in 6 seconds. But he did it in 6 days for a reason. Because that's when he established the week. The way this earth spins on its axis, the way it goes around the sun. Go back to Genesis chapter 1 for days and seasons and years. You know, he put these things in the heavens and he set this world on its course around the sun to mark time. And so he did it in 6 days for a reason. And then he rested on the 7th day and when we say again, God rested, that's accommodated language. God doesn't rest. He doesn't have to rest. He's not in a resting position. He's not supine and laying down or anything like that. But the fact of the matter is, he did it in 6 days for a reason. And then he said, on the 7th day, I rested. You're going to rest. And so it's absolutely literal. But here's what John Clayton said. He said that acceptance of Exodus 20:11 as literal history is a very shallow conclusion. Why? He says it's inconsistent with the Genesis record, really. We went over all that last week about the Hebrew that's used in Genesis chapter 1, about all the words that are used, that the only conclusion you can come to is 6 literal days. He says it's a quote of Genesis 2, and Genesis 2 is not a historical account. Well, maybe what he ought to do is interpret Genesis 2 in light of Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. But what he does is he comes to a conclusion about Genesis 2 and then says, well, you know, Exodus 20, verse 11 just can't mean that. That's what he's decided. So, even in the church, in the religious world, we have people that buy into this. So we ask ourselves the question, is it literal and historical, or is it poetical? So let's look at some reasons there on your outline. Number 1, as you see on the screen, the style is not mythical, allegorical, or poetical. What do I mean by that? The style of the way it's written. It is written as literal history. We know when we read passages in the Scriptures whether they're poetic or allegorical. Right? You go to the Psalms, you go to Proverbs, you go to other prophetical passages, you understand whether they're literal or figurative. And there's ways for determining that, but this language that's used in Genesis 1 through 11 is just straightforward. As one scholar, Edward Young, said, it sustains an intimate relationship with the remainder of the book. The remainder of the book presupposes the creation account, and the creation account prepares you for what follows. All those genealogies. And the characteristics, he says, of Hebrew poetry are lacking. Well, let me ask you this. Read Genesis 1 through 11 and read chapters 12 through 50 and tell me what's the difference. How does it read any different? You won't find any differences in style and syntax in the two sections of the book. Strictly historical. Number two, Christ viewed it as literal history. And frankly, to me, this kind of ends the whole discussion. Really, it gets down to it. We claim to be Christians. We claim that we have enthroned Christ as Lord and Savior in our lives. We go back to Matthew chapter 19. Let's do that real quick. Let's go back and see what he said. The Pharisees asked him about divorce. And he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And what does he do then? He quotes what? He quotes Genesis. What chapter? 2, right? For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And then he adds to that, then they that are no longer two, but one flesh, therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate. And so he stamps his divine approval on the historical accuracy of Genesis chapter 2. It's interesting, Jesus said on one occasion in John chapter 5, if you believed Moses, you would what? You would what? Who wrote Genesis? Moses did. Moses actually wrote Genesis, a long time after these events happened. We sometimes think of prophets, and we discussed this when we talked about biblical prophecy. But biblical prophecy involves writing not only about future events, but about present events and about past events. But all of it's inspired by the Holy Spirit. Moses is writing about things that he couldn't have seen, wasn't there to see firsthand. But he says, if you believed Moses, you would believe me. But if you believe not his writings, this is what the religious world needs to ask itself. If you believe not his writings, if you don't believe Genesis chapters 1 through 11, how shall you believe what? My words. How are you going to believe me? You don't believe Moses? Going to Matthew chapter 5, he says, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all things be accomplished. Is Genesis included in the law or not? So, if you don't believe Moses, you don't believe Christ. Well, what about the flood? Let's go look at Matthew chapter 24. Did Christ think the flood was a literal historical event? That's in chapters 1 through 11. But of that day and hour, Jesus says in Matthew 24:36, talking about his return, not the destruction of Jerusalem here, but his actual return. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of what? Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, did Jesus believe in a flood? They were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. Matthew chapter 23, he refers to Abel as a literal historical character. John 8:44, Jesus referred to Satan as who? Who was Satan? The father of lies. Who's the first liar in the Bible? Satan was, Genesis. Thou shalt not surely die. Father of lies. He kind of reminds me also of Luke chapter 16 in the account of the rich man and Lazarus. I believe that Personally, I believe that is an account, not a parable. And what did the rich man say to Abraham?
Send Lazarus back.
Send him back. If somebody will rise from the dead and appear to my brothers, they'll change. Abraham said, no, they won't change. They have Moses and the prophets. If they won't listen to them, they wouldn't change if someone rose from the dead.
Hey, Greg,
Yeah,
we got proof of that when Jesus raised Lazarus.
absolutely.
They just conspired right then. Right?
Yeah, Jesus raises a man from the dead, and all they can think about is how to kill him again. C. New Testament writers base doctrinal arguments on the literal and historical nature of the Genesis narrative. Here's some stats for you. Every New Testament writer made allusions to or quoted from the book of Genesis. In fact, all books of the New Testament except Philemon, 2 John, and 3 John contain allusions to Genesis. Of the 50 chapters in Genesis, only 7 are not quoted or cited in the New Testament. Chapters 20, 24, 34, 36, 40, 43, and 44, none of those in the first 11. Each of the first 11 chapters of Genesis is quoted or cited. None is omitted. There are 200 references to Genesis used by New Testament writers, more than half of which are from the first 11 chapters. 63 of those references are to the first 3 chapters of Genesis, while 14 are from the flood account and 58 are related to Abraham. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 8 and 12, Paul stated that woman is of, the Greek preposition, out of what? Woman is of or out of what? Man. He called Adam and Eve by name in 1 Timothy 2, verse 13. He considered Adam as historical as Moses, Romans 5:14. And Christ, 1 Corinthians 15, Adam and Christ are mentioned together. He labeled Adam as the first man in 1 Corinthians 15 and stated that the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, 2 Corinthians chapter 11. We've already looked at some of these passages. Peter uses the flood to make an analogy to our salvation. 1 Peter 3, he says, what about baptism? It's the like figure. It's the antitype of how Noah was saved. Right? 2 Peter chapter 3, of course, he refers to those uniformitarians that believe that all things go on as they were before, which Peter says they willfully and ignorantly forget that God destroyed the world with the flood. So you start talking about myth and allegory and poem, you damage the integrity of the Bible. You can't believe Christ or anything in Christ. D, its relationship, we should accept it as literal and historical because of its relationship to human redemption. If you don't, if Genesis 1 through 11 is not actually true, what is the purpose of the rest of the Bible? Now let's ask ourselves that question. If Adam and Eve didn't really fall, they didn't really sin, then what's the need for redemption? Salvation. What's the need for that promise in Genesis chapter 3? What's the need for Christ? I mean, the whole thread and theme of the Bible is built upon what happened in the first few chapters of it. Our need for salvation. And connected with that is the last point. It presents and traces the Messianic seed line. And you start in Genesis chapter 3, do you not? God said, I will put enmity between thy seed and the woman's seed. Right? And it will deliver a crushing blow to your head, Satan. And so that all starts in chapter 3. I like the way one writer summed it up. If we are unwilling to accept Genesis 1 through 11 as historical, how then will we be able to accept any biblical concept of man's origin, the unifying concept of the Old and New Testaments, the need for a coming Redeemer, God's personally designed plan of salvation, the sonship of Christ, the authority of the Scriptures? None of that. If you reject those first 11 chapters.
Paul made the argument that Adam was the first man. If you remove Adam as the first man, you remove Christ as the dead.
That's right. If Adam's not the first man, then what is Christ? What's Paul's argument? I like what John Whitcomb said, the one who did a lot of writing on the flood. He said, surely the words of rebuke given by our Lord to the two on the road to Emmaus must be applicable to many Christians today. Now, he's using that word, Christians, in a broad sense. O fools and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Slow of heart. So, it's terribly important that we understand that Genesis 1 through 11 it's not poetical, it's not allegorical, it's not mythical. It is absolute history. And it happened only a few thousand years ago. It's interesting to me, too, the purpose of Genesis chapter 1. I know BJ's kind of used to this, but, every year at lectureship, you have to assign different people to get up and do what before the speaker to speak. You have to introduce them, right? You ever had to do that? You ever had to introduce a speaker? And when you introduce a speaker, you have to think about who's in the audience, what's the circumstances of the occasion, who's being introduced, what's your relationship with them, all kinds of things you take into consideration in the introduction. And the first chapter of Genesis is our introduction to God. That's what it is. And sometimes we get caught up in the fact that Genesis chapter 1, we get caught up in what's its relationship to evolution and creation and all that, and that is important. But the fact of the matter is, it is really about God introducing himself to humanity. And sometimes we'll even say, and I guess we've all been guilty of this, but, it's kind of one of these cliches that's been around. Well, Genesis chapter 1 doesn't prove God, it just assumes God. Well, I understand what people are saying. It doesn't give a polemic argument for his existence. But it's much more than assuming God. It is introducing God. And if I look at the first 2, 3, 4 chapters of Genesis, what does it tell me about God? I mean, let's think about other gods. People have worshipped all kinds of gods throughout the years. What are the two biggest things that come to mind when you think about pagans in the past and maybe even today worshiping their gods? What are the two biggest elements? What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about your God? What's the most important thing? How powerful is he? Number one. Is he alive? But basically you think, okay, how powerful is he? And then, what does that mean for me? What can I get out of it? What are the benefits I get from worshiping this God? And so, looking at Genesis chapter 1, What's the first thing I'm introduced to when it comes to God? In the beginning, when time, He existed before time. He was eternal. In the beginning, God created heavens and the earth, His whole universe, His whole physical universe. It starts with a statement of His power and His superiority over the natural world. Paul did the same thing in Romans chapter 1, Acts chapter 14, Acts chapter 17. When he was speaking to pagans of his world, how would he start? This is the God who made the worlds, right? It's not the puny little idols you're worshiping.
We tried to introduce Mars Hill, those idols.
Right. Acts 17. So I guess the point I'm making is when we introduce God, maybe the first thing we should think about is calling attention to His power. That's what He did. That first verse, as I've already mentioned, also implies His eternality. In the beginning, before time, He created time. Time relates only to the physical universe in which you and I live. What else do I learn from Him? How did He create the universe? Spoke it into existence out of nothing. So I learned that God is a communicator. He also looked at it and He said, it's what? That it's good. I learned that God is an observant God. He's always observing things. He also said, let us make man in our image. He makes Adam, and He trots all the animals out in front of him, and Adam notices that, hey, everybody's got a companion with him. God always has a plan. He's a planner God. Any of you in here planners? Some people are planners, some aren't. And, you know, sometimes that can be frustrating if you're not a planner and you're dealing with a planner. Right? And if you're a planner dealing with a non-planner, it's frustrating. Those are two personalities that clash. I can see two people in the back row laughing. Usually it's in the husband and wife relationship. One's a planner, one's not. It can be either sex, doesn't matter. But I suppose if I had to think about it, maybe the planner is the one more like God. Because He's a planner. Made him in His image, gave him a special place in creation. I also find in Genesis, the first few chapters, that God is a delegator. You know, good leaders know how to delegate. They don't try to do everything themselves. What did God tell man when He put him in the garden? You're going to be what? You're going to have dominion. You're in charge. You're in charge of this world. Regardless of what the environmentalist says, we are at the top. And I'm proud of it. And I can eat the things that are below me. It reminds me of that time Ann Coulter was on the news. Somebody asked her, someone said, how can you eat those animals? They're like, how can you eat those animals? And she said, because they're yummy. That didn't make her happy. God is a commanding God. He commanded man to do. What's the first thing He told man to do? Yeah, but basically to do what? Be what? Fruitful and multiply. Have other people. God is a giving God. I see in the beginning of this book. Gave man everything he needed. Provided everything for him that he needed. I see He's a caring God. I see more commands when he tells him what he can eat and what he can't eat. I see that he's observant again because he observes it's not good for man to be alone. I see from Genesis chapter 3 that he is a God that requires obedience and punishes disobedience. How much do I learn from this introduction of God? It's not just that God's assumed. The whole book introduces me to his character, to his nature. And so when we just brush it aside as poetical and mythical and allegorical, we do great damage in our understanding of God. But it is literal and it is historical. And so we're going to continue with that theme in your next Roman numeral, man's sin and the flood. That's in those first 11 chapters. Let's talk about it. One of the first accounts you hear about in your classroom when you're a child, right? Noah and the flood. 2 by 2, the animals and all that. And you go into Genesis chapter 6, and this world's been around for a while. You know, it's estimated sometimes at the time of the flood, there could have been 1 billion people. Based on math and population statistics. But verse 5 of Genesis chapter 6 says, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry. He regretted that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing, and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But it's interesting. What else do I find in the first 11 chapters of Genesis? Verse 8. The grace of God. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. More about God's nature is revealed. So Noah had remained faithful. He was an island of righteousness and a sea of iniquity, I guess you could say. And it's interesting, look at the expressions that are used to describe Noah there in verse 9. This is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was what? A just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. That's 3 pretty astounding characteristics right there of Noah. And he did all that. That was his character, even though he was surrounded by evil. The earth was also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. You know, anytime people, if you go back up to the beginning of the chapter, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men, and they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. You know, anytime you see people governed by their passions and sexual immorality, you're going to find violence. The two go hand in hand. And so God gives a probationary period of a maximum of 120 years, according to verse 3. My spirit shall not always strive with man, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. And what did Noah do during that 100 or so years he was building the ark? Yeah, he preached according to 1 Peter chapter 3 and 2 Peter chapter 2. While he's building an ark, Noah's out preaching. Pretty good object lesson, wouldn't you think? And the flood is one of the most prominent accounts in the Bible. Actually, it gets a lot more attention in the Bible than creation. 4 of the first 11 chapters are about the flood. And there's a good reason for that. The flood is the greatest single, other than creation, is the greatest single geological event the earth has ever seen. It totally changed the nature of this world. And you can do your own study on that. There's a lot of people that have written a lot of good things about the probable nature of this world before the flood, about the climate, and so forth. But it changed dramatically You want to talk about tornadoes, hurricanes? That's the flood. This world was not like that before. We cannot imagine what this world was like. I expect we can't imagine how big, strong, and beautiful people were. I mean, we've had a few thousand years of genetic, what's the word? Decomposition. Deterioration, yeah. Deterioration. Because we've been exposed to things they weren't. Various sun rays and so forth. I mean, they lived 900 years. What kind of world, what kind of environment would you have to live in to live over 900 years? And so it is the greatest thing to happen to this world since creation, and the greatest thing that will happen to it physically until Jesus says, I come back, and it won't be water this time. There are repeated references to the flood account in numerous books within the Old Testament, including, of course, Jesus and other writers of the New Testament. We've already mentioned some of those. I like what this writer said, Alfred Raywinkle, 1951. The flood marks the end of a world of transcendent beauty, created by God as a perfect abode for man and the beginning of a new world, a mere shadowy replica of its original glory. You know, sometimes we talk about, man, you know, mountain vistas, all this world's pretty, ocean, the beach, it's all pretty. It's nothing compared to what it was. In all recorded history, there is no other event except the fall which has had such a revolutionary effect upon the topography and condition of this earth, and which has so profoundly affected human history in every phase of life now, as it now exists in its manifold forms in the world. No geologist, biologist, or student of history can afford to ignore this great catastrophe. The sad thing about this is all the great scientists of the past who were creationists did not ignore this event, and science made leaps and bounds. I can guarantee you now that most scientists being evolutionists, we're not going to make strides because you're not looking at it through the right lenses. Somebody says, well, how did the water get over Mount Everest? You understand there was no Mount Everest before. Where did all that water go? How deep is the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean? There was no Mariana Trench. This world changed drastically. It was underwater for months. And the continents were moving. There was all kinds of things going on. God was doing. And so when you think about the world before the flood, it's a totally different concept. So we have to ask ourselves the question, local? That's the argument you generally get, even in the religious world. Well, it's a local flood. Wasn't universal. Well, it matters how we look at it. So let's talk about it. Genesis 7:11. Let's go there. You want to know the extent of this event? Look at verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Somebody said, you know, the earth couldn't flood in just 40 days. No. It wasn't just rain. I'm sure it was a rain like we've never seen. But still, it wasn't just rain. It didn't all come from the sky. He said the fountains of the great deep were broken up. And that water rose. And the waters prevailed, verse 19, exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the... Now, let's read this slowly. Notice these words. All the high hills under the what?
The whole heaven.
Whole heaven were covered. Now, how many does that include?
All.
All Morris said in their work, it's a double all of the high heels, under all whole helmet, depending on the train. So it had to be university. And that gets us to the question, and we'll talk about this next week. If it was local, why throw a building on? Why build it on? Ask yourself that question. If it's a local flood, why am I spending 100 years, God, to build this boat? When I could have just moved.
Yeah.
And in 100 years, I could get pretty far away. All right, we'll pick up there.